Thank you so much. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Lutz. Thank you, Olaf. Thanks to all of you for coming. This is a tremendous honor, and the MONREPOS Award, to say nothing of the that other prize that's mentioned, reminds me of the acceptance speech of the American comedian Jack Benny when he got some award, and he said, I don't deserve this, but I have arthritis, and I don't deserve that either. The honor is multiplied by the fact that the patrons of the award are two of my scientific heroes. Irenaeus Abel Ibsfeld was a true pioneer in understanding human psychology in an evolutionary framework, and I still use many of his examples in my undergraduate lectures, perhaps my favorite of which is his documentation that in all human cultures, the eyebrow flash is used as a friendly greeting, and so I would like to greet all of you this evening in honor of Irenaeus Abel Ibsfeld with an eyebrow flash. And the honor is multiplied yet again by the patronage of one of my heroes, Richard Dawkins, who has influenced me not just in my understanding of life and mind, human nature, through his books beginning with The Selfish Gene, The Extended Phenotype, Blind Watchmaker, Climbing Mount Improbable, which have deeply informed my understanding of life and mind, but also his model as a English prose stylist. One book that Richard did not mention, it's not been translated into German, is The Sense of Style, the Thinking Person's Guide to Writing in the 21st Century, and I began my writing style manual with the advisory that to really become a good writer, one shouldn't just follow rules in a style book, but one should reverse engineer examples of excellent writing when one comes across them. And the first example that I gave was a passage from Richard Dawkins' Unwrapping Rainbow. So thank you very much, Richard. Thanks to all of you. I'm going to speak about my most recent book, Enlightenment Now, Aufklärung, Jetzt. And it begins with some deep questions that all of us ask ourselves. Why is the world filled with trouble? How can we make it better? How do we give meaning and purpose to our lives? Well, as deep and difficult as these questions may seem, many people have answers to them. For example, morality is dictated by God in Holy Scriptures. When everyone obeys his laws, the world will be perfect. Or, problems are the fault of evil people, which must be shamed, punished, and defeated. Or, our tribe should claim its rightful greatness under the control of a strong leader who embodies its authentic virtue. Or, in the past, we lived in a state of order and harmony until alien forces brought on decadence and degeneration. We must restore the society to its golden age. Well, what about the rest of us? Many people know what they don't believe, but have more trouble identifying what they do believe. In my book, Enlightenment Now, Aufklärung, Jetzt, I suggest that there is an alternative system of beliefs and values, the one that we associate with the Enlightenment. Namely, that we can use knowledge to enhance human flourishing. Many people embrace the ideals of the Enlightenment without being able to name or describe them. As a result, they've faded into the background as a bland status quo or establishment. The other ideologies have passionate advocates, and I suggest that Enlightenment ideals, too, need a positive defense and an explicit commitment. That is what I've tried to offer. The Enlightenment, I suggest, revolves around four themes: reason, science, humanism, and progress, and let me say a few words about each. It all begins with reason, the understanding that traditional sources of belief are generators of delusion. Faith, revelation, tradition, authority, charisma, mysticism, intuition, the parsing of sacred texts are all ways of being wrong. Reason, in contrast, is non-negotiable. As soon as you try to provide reasons why we should trust anything other than reason, As soon as you explain why you're right, why other people should believe you, that you're not lying or full of crap, you've lost the argument because you have appealed to reason. As a cognitive psychologist, I would be the first to acknowledge that human beings on their own are not particularly reasonable. We generalize from anecdotes, we as a species. We reason from stereotypes. We seek evidence that confirms our beliefs, and we ignore evidence that disconfirms them. And we're all overconfident about our knowledge, our wisdom, and our virtue. But people are capable of reason if they adopt certain norms: free speech, open criticism and debate, logical analysis, fact-checking, and empirical testing, which leads to the second enlightenment value, science. Science is based on the conviction that the world is intelligible, that we can try to understand it by formulating possible explanations and testing them against reality. Science has shown itself to be our most reliable means of understanding the world, including ourselves. An important Enlightenment ideal was that there can be a science of human nature, and that beliefs about society are testable, just like other beliefs about the world. The third ideal is humanism, that the ultimate moral purpose is to reduce the suffering and enhance the flourishing of human beings and other conscious creatures. Well, enhance human flourishing, you might think, who could possibly be against that? As it happens, there are alternatives to humanism, such as that the ultimate good is to enhance the glory of the tribe, the nation, the race, the class, or the faith, to obey the dictates of a divinity, pressure others to do the same, to achieve feats of heroic greatness, or to advance some mystical force or dialectic or struggle or pursuit of a utopian or messianic age. Humanism is feasible because people are endowed with a sense of sympathy, concern with the welfare of others. By default, our circle of sympathy is rather small, and we naturally feel the pain only of our genetic relatives, our close friends and allies, cute little furry baby animals, and that's about it. But our circle of sympathy can be expanded through the forces of cosmopolitanism, the mixing of people and ideas, including education, journalism, art, mobility, and even pure reason. As soon as I engage in discussion with you, I can't insist that only my interests are special because I'm me and you're not, and hope for you to take me seriously. Finally, we get to the ideal of progress, that if we apply knowledge and sympathy to reduce suffering and enhance flourishing, we can gradually succeed. So, 250 years later, how did that Enlightenment thing work out? I have found that if you ask most intellectuals, the answer is not very well, because intellectuals, I have found, hate progress. And intellectuals who call themselves progressive really hate progress. If you think we can solve problems, I have been told, that means that you have a blind faith and a quasi-religious belief in the outmoded superstition of the false promise of the myth of the onward march of inevitable progress. You are a cheerleader for vulgar American can-do-ism, with the rah-rah spirit of boardroom ideology, Silicon Valley, and the Chamber of Commerce. You are a practitioner of Whig history, a naive optimist, a Pollyanna, and of course a Pangloss, alluding to Voltaire's character who declared all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds, which, as it happens, was Voltaire's satire of Leibniz, so perhaps it's suitable that I bring this up in an event that is partly affiliated with the Leibniz Society. Well, as it turned out, Professor Pangloss was what we would today call a pessimist. A true optimist believes there can be much better worlds than the one we find ourselves in today. But all of that is irrelevant because the question of whether progress has or has not taken place is not a matter of wearing rose-colored glasses or seeing the glass as half full or having a sunny disposition. It's an empirical hypothesis. Human well-being can be measured. Life, health, sustenance, prosperity, peace, freedom, safety, knowledge, leisure, happiness. If they have increased over time, I submit, that would be progress. Well, let's look at the data. Beginning with the most precious thing of all, life. For most of human history, life expectancy at birth hovered around 30 years of age. Then, with the invention of vaccination, sanitation, antibiotics, and other advances in public health and medicine, life expectancy has increased worldwide to 71 years, and virtually no one guesses that it's that high. 80 in the developed countries of Europe and the Americas. But in Asia has recently caught up, and sub-Saharan Africa is rapidly closing the gap as well. For most of human history, the biggest contributor to low average lifespans was child mortality. In Sweden in 1750, for example, 1/3 of children did not live to see their 5th birthday. Sweden brought its rate of child mortality down by a factor of 100, and the rest of the world followed suit, including Canada, South Korea, Chile, and Ethiopia, whose rate of child mortality is reduced from 25% to less than 5% in just 20 years. Sustenance. For most of human history, the struggle to feed oneself has been only intermittently successful. It takes about 2,500 calories to feed a moderately active young man. And for the first time in history, Britain was able to grow that many calories because of advances in agronomy, such as crop rotation during the British Agricultural Revolution. Later, the invention of synthetic fertilizers here in Germany, the mechanization of agriculture, the selective breeding of vigorous hybrids during the Green Revolution. And so other countries have followed suit. More recently, China, India, and the world as a whole has been able to grow enough calories to feed their populations. Now, one might say that this is a dubious example of progress if all of those calories are just making fat people fatter. But in fact, the world has reduced the rate of undernourishment from 35% in poor countries in 1970 to less than 15% today, starting in Latin America and in Asia, and it's now happening in sub-Saharan Africa. Thanks to this abundance of calories, famine, which was one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and could strike anywhere in the world without warning, now is a rarity and is a result not of crop failures or an inability to grow enough food, but from wars and geographical remoteness that prevents the food from getting to where it is needed. Prosperity. For most of human history, there was little to no economic growth to speak of. You can see this in a graph of the gross world product from the year 1 to the present, which shows that for more than 1,600 years, economic growth was less than 1 pixel high. But then with the Industrial Revolution and advances in technology, spread of education, the institutionalization of markets and finance, and the globalization of trade, gross world product has increased by a factor of 200 since the 18th century. Again, this would be a dubious form of progress if all of that wealth just went to the 1%. And in fact, it has been highly uneven across the world's regions, with the UK, US, and Germany showing a similar curve, escaping from universal squalor and poverty first. But in recent years, Asian countries like South Korea have shot up, as have Latin American countries like Chile, and China and India are showing exponential growth as well. There's the graph for as a whole. As a result, extreme poverty, defined as the bare minimum necessary to feed oneself and one's family, has declined from 90% of the world's population 200 years ago to less than 10% of the world's population today. In fact, there's been a 75% reduction in extreme poverty worldwide just in the last 30 years. Because of this development, international inequality, the gap between rich countries and poor countries, which necessarily increased with the Industrial Revolution as some countries escaped from universal poverty, leaving the others behind, has now turned a corner, and international equality has started to decrease because poor countries are getting richer faster than rich countries are getting richer. Now, of course, within developed countries, inequality has increased. That does not mean that developed countries have become more indifferent to the plight of the poor over time. Quite the contrary. For hundreds of years, rich countries devoted about 1.5% of their gross domestic product to redistribution to the poor, to children, to the sick, to the aged. But in the 20th century, every developed country went on had an expansion of social spending. So today, a median OECD country redistributes 22% of its GDP. Because of this redistribution, poverty, when it is measured after government benefits, has decreased, even in a country with high inequality like the United States, from 33% in 1960 to 7% today. When poverty is measured in terms of consumption, what people can afford to buy, taking into account the plunging prices of food and clothing, then poverty rate is less than 3%. Peace. Olaf, in inviting me to speak this evening, asked if I could mention some data on Paleolithic archaeology that might be relevant to this book, and so I'm going to talk about an application of archaeological data to one aspect of progress that I explored in The Better Angels of Our Nature, Gewalt. It speaks to the question of whether, when we look at the history of war over the course of the human species, is it a story of progress that is decreasing rates of war or decline, decreasing rates of war? This is an ancient question, and it was perhaps most famously raised in an exchange begun with Thomas Hobbes, 1651, who speculated that during the time men lived without a common power to keep them all in awe, namely a government or state, they are in that condition which is called war. In that condition, the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. A century later, Jean-Jacques Rousseau equally famously answered that nothing could be more gentle than man in his primitive state, and all ulterior improvements have been so many steps towards the decrepitness of the species. Now, both of these men were speculating from their armchairs. Neither of them had any idea what life was like before states, before government, and so the matter was open to speculation for literally many centuries. And in fact, until the 1990s, the picture of the history of war was obscured by what I think of as the anthropologists of peace fallacy, which I name after a number of anthropologists who declared themselves to be advocates of peace. And they worked according to the following dubious logic. If war is ancient, then war would be in the genes. That would imply that humans will always wage war, and working for peace would be a waste of time. Working for peace is important, therefore war cannot be ancient. Now, that's only a bit oversimplified. You can actually find an argument like this almost in so many words in the writings of a number of ethnographers, up to the present day, I should add. I think it should be clear why it is a fallacy. It would be like saying that ancient humans could not have had infectious disease, because it's very important that we combat infectious disease through advances in medicine. And if we as a species are prone to infectious disease, it would mean that medical research is a waste of time. Therefore, there was no infectious disease in prehistoric times. I think the first archaeologist who called out who questioned this general line of thinking, which led to, I think, what many ethnographers and archaeologists might see as a kind of an empirical bias in the field to try to minimize any evidence for prehistoric violence, prehistoric aggression. This was first noted by the archaeologist Lawrence Keeley, whose book War Before Civilization, which came out 23 years ago. in which he called attention to this, to what he thought of as a spin doctoring or a suppression or a biasing of data, both in ethnography and archaeology. And he called attention to the prevalence of violence, including collective violence, coalitional violence, warfare, if you'd like, in prehistoric societies, citing evidence from forensic archaeology, such as bashed-in skulls, decapitations, bones with arrowheads embedded in them, and mummies preserved in bogs that were found with a rope around their necks. In my book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, I reproduced Keeley's data, and I added a few other estimates of rates of violent death in archaeological sites. I think I found between Keeley and Samuel Bowles and Azar Ghat, 21 archaeological sites for which rates of violent death have been estimated. And as you can see, they span quite a range. And there are sites that have no violent deaths. There's some that have 60% of the remains show signs of violent trauma. The average of these sites was about 15%. And that, needless to say, is much higher than one finds in more recent societies. For example, one estimate of deaths in warfare in Europe and the United States in the 20th century says that about 6/10 of 1% of the deaths were due to warfare, and this includes, of course, both world wars. If one were to attempt for a higher estimate, putting in all the deaths from genocides, all the indirect deaths from disease and warfare that are collateral damage from wars, you can get a figure of about 3%. And if one looked in the 21st century, the rate of death in warfare is about 3/100ths of 1%. Well, these data came out 23 years ago in Keeley's book. They have been criticized because it's hard to tell. I don't have to explain this to most of the people in this room. It's often difficult to tell whether one should attribute signs of violent death to war or personal violence, homicide, although in small-scale societies, when you have a homicide that then inspires an act of revenge, and then revenge for the revenge, and you get cycles of feuding, it's hard to know where to draw the line between interpersonal violence and warfare. But there are other uncertainties, in some cases of uncertainties of dating, in other cases underestimates or overestimates of rates of violent death from skeletal remains, and the question of how representative this particular sample of sites that Keeley cited that I reduced are. Since The Better Angels of Our Nature came out, there have been a couple of studies that have tried to fill in some of the uncertainties from the archaeological record, and I'll cite just two. I'm sure they're familiar to people in this room. One was the report by Marta Mirazon-Lar, Robert Foley, and many others of a quite remarkable site excavated in the shores of Lake Turkana, Kenya, which showed 27 skeletal remains that showed unmistakable signs of violent trauma. I won't go through them since I'm not the expert in this room on how one does the forensics to ascertain that the bodies met their end through violence, but it was unmistakable in this particular site. Many skeletons with skulls that have bashed in behind, arrowheads embedded in bones, and a woman who appears to have been tied up before her skull was bashed in. And this shows that, that at least in this group, there was a unmistakable coalitional aggression, or warfare, in a society that was not just pre-state, but was hunter-gatherer before agriculture and without signs of horticulture or herding. Again, that's just one site, and perhaps the most comprehensive survey of the archaeological literature, probably the opposite of Keeley and choosing a few sites. This one perhaps was too inclusive, according to some critics, a study by Jose Gomez and his collaborators, where they looked through into their analysis every study they could find the archaeological record, ethnographic record, to put rates of human violence in phylogenetic perspective. And I'll just cite some of their conclusions, which I should add, by the way, for introducing these numbers, that there are several different questions one can ask about rates of violence using the archaeological record. One of them is, were there higher rates of violence in hunter-gatherer societies as opposed to other forms of social organization, horticulturalist, herding, tribes and chiefdoms as opposed to bands? Another question one could ask is, has there been a decline in warfare over time? Was there some transition in the archaeological record between high rates of violence from warfare and low rates? Neither of these is relevant to the question that I asked and the question that divided Hobbes and Rousseau, which is not about hunting and gathering, not about a transition in time, but rather the effect of states. That is, does the imposition of state control lead to a pacification that reduces rates of interpersonal violence, raiding, and feuding? And those three questions are often conflated in the controversies surrounding Keeley and myself and others. So the relevant one is the comparison between non-state and state societies. And here, Gomez et al. Concluded that the rate of percentage of deaths due to violence in bands, tribes, and chieftains from the archaeological record was between 3.5% and 14%. Trying to also restrict evidence to the archaeological record, the proportion of deaths that were violent deaths among states was 0.25%. If you try to corroborate that difference with a different kind of evidence, say the ethnographic evidence or evidence from the present, once again, they found that in bands and tribes living out of the control of states, the rate of violent death, that is, proportion of deaths that were to be attributed to violence, was 10% for bands, 4% for tribes, and 1.3% for states. So I take these later studies as not corroborating the point estimates, but as affirming the hypothesis that state societies have lower rates of death from warfare than non-state societies. Let me turn now back to the data that I review in Enlightenment Now, and in particular the history of war in historical times, in particular in modern times. One generalization about war over the last 500 years is that whereas at the beginning of the modern period, the major states and empires in the world were pretty much always at war, and peace was merely an interlude between wars. One can see this in a graph that plots the percentage of years in each 25-year period in which the great powers of the day were at each other's throats in major wars. What we can see is that several hundred years ago, the great powers were pretty much always at war. Today, they are never at war. The last great power war pitted the United States against China in Korea more than 65 years ago. If we zoom in on the 20th century, we see that even as wars were becoming rarer and shorter, they were becoming more destructive, culminating in the First and Second World War, which had unparalleled concentration of a number of deaths per year. But contrary to predictions that I grew up with, that it was only a matter of time before the world would see a Third World War, pitting the United States against the Soviet Union, fought with nuclear weapons and therefore more destructive even than the First and Second World Wars, the Soviet Union went out of existence, the Cold War ended, and World War III never happened. If, in fact, we zoom in on the period after the Second World War, you see that there's been an uneven but unmistakable decline in the rate of death from all wars, including civil wars and wars between smaller nations. How could this have happened if we descend from people who had high rates of warfare? Well, it's because, like other changes, other kinds of progress that I will be speaking about this evening, they are the result of human institutions, workarounds for the darker parts of human nature, the opportunities for the better angels of our nature, as Abraham Lincoln put it, to subdue our demons. In the case of war, these would include the rise of democracy, because democracies are somewhat less likely to fight each other, a hypothesis originally advanced by Immanuel Kant. The growth of commerce, another hypothesis from Immanuel Kant, that countries that trade with each other have less of an incentive to invade each other because you don't kill your customers, you don't kill your debtors, and if it's cheaper to buy things than to steal them, you are less tempted to engage in plunder. It also due to the rise of peacekeeping forces from the United Nations and other organizations that act as referees that get in between warring countries, and changes in international laws and norms. Organizations like the United Nations and the European Union, and international laws that and norms that make conquest something that is no longer acceptable. It used to be that, as von Clausewitz said, war was the continuation of policy by other means. Might makes right, and to the victor go the spoils. That is no longer the accepted form among nations, and conquests have declined greatly. The fact that the Russian conquest of Crimea in 2014 was considered such an outrage and not recognized by the rest of the international community, even though it was a tiny bit of territory that used to belong to Russia, is a sign of changing norms, all of which collectively have resulted in the decline of war, even with the presence of warlike sentiments and desires, which we hear all too often, but which fortunately are less likely to result in actual shooting. Freedom and rights. We have all read with dismay and fear about the rise of autocracy in Russia, Turkey, Venezuela, in Poland and Hungary. But nonetheless, if you look across the world and you add up the number of democracies and the number of autocracies scaled by how democratic, how autocratic they are, you see that the world has never been more democratic than it has been in this decade. Whereas the world used to have a handful of democracies embracing 1% of the world's population, nowadays 2/3 of the world's countries are more democratic than autocratic, and 2/3 of the world's population is in countries that are democratic. Now, some people are surprised when they hear this because we have all been told that democracy is in retreat. But remember, just as recently as the 1970s, the world had only 31 democracies. It seems almost perverse to say this in Germany, a country that was divided by the Iron Curtain, on the eastern side of which every country was dominated by Marxist totalitarian dictatorships. But even west of the Iron Curtain, Spain and Portugal were fascist governments through the 1970s. Greece was under the control of the colonels, a military junta. Almost all of Latin America was ruled by military dictatorships. In East Asia, Taiwan, South Korea, Philippines, Indonesia were military dictatorships, all of them democratic today. And going back to another form of violence, interpersonal violence or violent crime, there's a general trend that in any state of anarchy, one gets high rates of violence. And this connects to my earlier discussion of violence in the archaeological record. And now turning to the recent historical record, where, well, not so recent, but say the last millennium, where we do have quantitative data on rates of homicide, we find that in medieval Europe, the homicide rate was 35 per 100,000 per year. But then as the first kingdoms established control over the medieval feudal patchwork of fiefs, bringing their territories under control, the homicide rate declined in every European country, and so today it's approximately 1 per 100,000 per year, a decline by a factor of more than 35. And that process is repeated whenever governments bring their frontier regions under their control, so that the ethic of, or the violence reduction technique of revenge, leading to feuds and cycles of violence and vendettas, is replaced by a criminal justice system and the rule of law. It happened again in colonial New England. It happened again in the American Wild West. And it happened in Mexico, which still has a high rate of homicide, but a century ago, its rate was 5 times as high. We zoom in on the last 50 years or so, we see that after going through a reversal in the decline of homicide in the 1960s, when the United States and pretty much every Western country had a huge increase in the rate of violence, starting in the 90s, industrialized countries brought their rate of violence under control, and it fell in the United States by a factor of more than half. And in the world as a whole, the rate of homicide has fallen by about 35% just in the last 2 decades. In fact, we've been getting safer in just about every way because of advances in the design of automobiles and of highways. Your chance of getting killed in a car accident are 96% lower than they were a century ago. We are 88% less likely to be killed on the sidewalk as pedestrians, 99% less likely to die in a plane crash, 59% less likely to fall to our deaths, 90% less likely to drown, 92% less likely to die in a fire, 92% less likely to be asphyxiated. But there is one exception to the trend of increasing safety in the United States. That is the category that safety experts call poison by solid or liquid. It includes drug overdoses, and here you see the American opioid epidemic, exception to the trend of increasing safety. At the same time, we're 95% less likely to be killed on the job. We're even less likely to die from an act of God, as we say in English. The droughts, floods, wildfires, volcanoes, tsunamis, heat waves, meteor strikes, and earthquakes, presumably not because God is any less angry with us, but because of improvements in the resilience of our infrastructure, in early warning systems, and in emergency disaster responses. And what about the quintessential act of God, the projectile hurled by Zeus, the literal bolt from the blue? Yes, we are 97% less likely to be killed by a bolt of lightning. Knowledge, the natural state of humanity, is to be illiterate and ignorant, and for most of history, only a privileged few could read and write. In early modern Europe, 15% of the population could read and write. 85% of Europeans were illiterate. The literacy rate was brought up to 100% in the 20th century in every European country and the United States, and now that process is being replicated elsewhere, such as in Latin America by Chile and Mexico, and indeed in the world as a whole. The world is now 80% literate, and among people under the age of 25, 90% literate. Compare that to 15% literacy in Europe several centuries ago. And in perhaps the most amazing, astonishing, incredible, difficult to swallow example of progress, we have been getting smarter. This is true. As unbelievable as it may sound, in a well-documented phenomenon known as the Flynn effect, IQ scores have been increasing around the world by 3 points a decade. This is not due to any program of eugenics or selective breeding, but rather to the spread of public health and education, and probably to the proliferation of abstract concepts, visual symbols, technical terms from science and technology into everyday life. Okay, do any of these increases that economists like to measure actually make our lives any better? And the answer is they have. For example, in 1870, the average work week in Western Europe and the United States was 62 hours. Today it is less than 40. Because of the universal penetration of running water and electricity, the widespread adoption of labor-saving devices like washing machines, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, dishwashers, stoves, and microwaves, the amount of our lives that we lose to housework, which people say is their least favorite way of spending their time, has gone from more than 60 hours a week to less than 15 hours a week. Because our work week has been getting shorter and we waste less time on housework, the amount of leisure time has increased over the last 50 years, both among men and women. Now, you can't help but notice that the leisure time for women has leveled off. Why would that be true? It's because women today spend more time with their children. A single working woman today spends more time with her children than a married stay-at-home mother did in the 1950s. So forget your nostalgia for the 1950s. Now is the age of family closeness. Well, do any of these gains make us any happier? And the answer is, on average, they do. There is, for one thing, a strong relationship between life satisfaction and income, gross domestic product per capita. This is plotted on a logarithmic scale, which means that an extra euro makes a poor person much happier than it makes a rich person. But nonetheless, it applies across the scale. Each dot is a country. Each arrow impaling a dot is represents the relationship between income and happiness within a country. So what the graph shows is that people in richer countries are happier. Within every country, richer people are happier. The prediction is, as the world gets richer, its people should be getting happier. Do they? Well, for the data that we have, which only spans 40 years, in 86% of countries for which we do have longitudinal data, happiness has increased. The United States is not one of them, but Germany is. Here you have some data for Germany and India and Russia, two other countries where happiness has increased. Germany, by the way, I looked it up, is the 15th happiest country out of 156 for which we have data, and with happiness increasing compared to 20 years ago. Well, I hope to have convinced you that progress is not a matter of having a good attitude or seeing the glass as half full. It is a fact of human history, perhaps the greatest fact of human history. So how is this fact reflected in the news? Well, a study of the tone of the news using sentiment mapping, that is tallying the percentage of positive to negative news, has found that in all of these decades in which our lives have gotten longer, healthier, safer, better educated, more peaceful, and happier, the New York Times has gotten increasingly morose, and a sample of the world's broadcasts has also gotten glummer and glummer. So why do people deny progress? Part of the reason comes from an interaction between our cognitive psychology and the nature of journalism, and to some extent history. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, a pair of cognitive psychologists. Tversky died in 1995. Kahneman went on to win the Nobel Prize in Economics, in part for this work, showed that the people estimate risk according to how easily they can recall examples from memory. We use our brain's search engine as a way of estimating frequency in the world. So if we read about a shark attack, then we don't go into the water because we think that sharks are a major menace. And people think that tornadoes kill more people every year than asthma attacks, whereas in fact asthma attacks kill 80 times as many people as tornadoes. But tornadoes are really fun to watch on television, and asthma attacks not so much. Well, in fact, consider the nature of news on television. News is about things that happen, not things that don't happen. You never see a reporter on TV saying, "I'm reporting live from a country that is at peace," or a city that has not been attacked by terrorists. As long as the number of violent incidents in the world has not fallen to zero, There will always be enough to cover in the news, and that can drive our intuitions into thinking that violence is more prevalent than ever, or even that it has increased. Also, news by its very nature is about sudden events, not gradual changes. The economist Max Roser points out that the news could have had the headline, 137,000 people escaped from extreme poverty yesterday, every day for the last 30 years. But they never ran that headline, with the result that 1.25 billion people escaped from extreme poverty, and no one knows about it. On top of these inherent distorters, there is a negativity bias in news media. Most journalists think that serious journalism is about threats and dangers and scandal and corruption, and that any positive development is advertising, propaganda, Pravda, boasting that pig iron production is up 10% last year. And so there is together with the accidental distortions of journalism, there is something of a intentional distortion. This was satirized by the American humor newspaper called The Onion. In the headline, CNN holds morning meeting to decide what viewers should panic about for the rest of the day. Well, if you combine the nature of our psychology with the nature of journalism, you can see why the world has been coming to an end for a very long time indeed. Let me end with 3 questions about progress and enlightenment that I suspect have occurred to many of you. First, you might think, isn't it good to be pessimistic so that we don't get complacent, speak truth to power, we discover corruption and scandals? Well, not exactly. I suggest that it is good to be accurate. Of course, we need to be aware of danger and suffering and injustice wherever it occurs, but we also have to be aware of how they can be reduced. Because countering the danger of complacency on one side, there are dangers of indiscriminate pessimism on the other. One of them is fatalism. If you think that despite all the efforts to make the world a better place, things just keep getting worse and worse and worse, natural response is, why waste time and money on a hopeless cause? In fact, if you think that we are doomed, that if climate change doesn't do us in, then runaway artificial intelligence and robots, the natural response is, well, let's just enjoy ourselves while we can. Nothing we can do about it. Let our grandchildren worry about it. The other danger of indiscriminate pessimism is radicalism. If you think our institutions are failing and are beyond all hope for reform, a natural response is to smash the machine, drain the swamp, burn the empire to the ground in the hope that anything that rises out of the ashes is bound to be better than what we have today. Or to empower a leader who promises, and these words will send a chill down the spine of every American, only I can fix it. Second question, is progress inevitable? And the answer is, of course not. Progress does not mean that everything gets better for everyone, everywhere, all the time. That wouldn't be progress. That would be a miracle. That would be magic. And progress is not magic. Progress consists of using knowledge to solve problems. Problems are inevitable, and solutions create new problems that must be solved in turn. Also, the world faces major challenges that have not yet been solved. Foremost among them are climate change and the threat of nuclear war. And I argue in my discussion of these existential threats in the book that we should treat them as problems that are unsolved but solvable rather than as apocalypses in waiting. That we should decarbonize the world's economy via a combination of policy, particularly carbon pricing and technology. That is the development of low, zero, and eventually negative carbon technologies, including not just renewables, but nuclear power and carbon capture and storage. And we should deal with the threat of nuclear war by increasing international stability to prevent crises, to prevent miscalculations and misunderstandings, and the reduction of nuclear arms culminating in the total abolition of all nuclear weapons. A policy policy goal that was once seen as romantic, as something that only the beatniks and the hippies would want, now has been embraced by an increasing number of realist Cold War hawks, including Henry Kissinger and George Shultz. Final question. Does the Enlightenment go against human nature? This is a pointed question for me, because I have advocated the existence of human nature. Is humanism just too arid, tepid, or flattened to get people's hearts pumping? Is the conquest of disease, famine, poverty, violence, and ignorance boring? Do people need to believe in miracles, Father in the sky, a strong chief to protect the tribe, myths of heroic ancestors? Well, I don't think so. For one thing, secular liberal democracies, like Germany, are the happiest and healthiest places on earth, probably in the history of our species, and they are the prime destination of people who, as we say, vote with their feet. Also, I dare say that applying knowledge and sympathy to enhance human flourishing is glorious, heroic, perhaps even spiritual. This is a hero story that is not just a myth. Myths are fictions, and this one is true. True to the best of our knowledge, which is the only truth we can have. And it's a hero story that belongs not just to one tribe, but to all of humanity. Because it depends on nothing more than the conviction that life is better than death, health is better than sickness, abundance is better than want, freedom is better than coercion, peace is better than war, happiness is better than suffering, and knowledge is better than superstition and ignorance. Thank you for listening, and thank you for this wonderful award. Thank you.